Welcome to Gatecrashers, a podcast dedicated to kicking open the door to your next favorite thing. Our mission, our creed, and our code is this: to make all things more approachable and accessible to everyone. We want you to find a universe that you'll fall in love with. Today, I'm joined by John Harris Dunning, whose new book, Wiper, comes out on November 16th from Dark Horse Comics. I'm Dan. My pronouns are he, him. John, how are you?
I'm really well. I'm really excited to join you today.
I'm very excited to talk with you. I was telling you beforehand, I got to actually peek at the physical edition at New York. Yeah. This book is wild. And it comes at a time where like all I wanted was more sci-fi futuristic. I have a question for you, but I'll get to it in a second because I want to talk about what kind of world you believe it is, because I don't want to get too far into it yet because I do have to ask you one question up front. And I'm a pretty hard-hitting journalist. So if you haven't heard, if no one has told you that about me, I do start off with a pretty tough one.
Excellent.
What's your favorite sandwich?
Ooh. Okay. I think I'm going to be a little bit traditional, which isn't usually my thing, but I probably like a smashed avocado and egg sandwich, actually. Yeah.
You know what? I don't think anyone's ever given an answer. So just one avocado smash with eggs on it.
Yeah. Lovely. Right. Some white sourdough bread. Delicious.
Okay, that's a solid answer.
Like a breakfast, but it could be lunch as well. You kind of don't have to commit to either.
Yeah, because it's got the fats and it's got the protein. You're good to go.
Yeah.
All right. So for Wiper, what is your elevator pitch for the book? When you're describing it to someone new, how would you describe it?
Well, it's a sci-fi, maybe Philip K. Dick style private investigator mystery. Would be a really basic way of approaching it. So that's what it is. It's looking at identity and how we manufacture our identities. But it was quite interesting what you were talking about earlier about the building of the world, because it almost felt like the creation of the world furnished the characters rather than the other way around in a strange way. I don't know whether you felt that when you were reading it.
So, yeah, I read the whole thing. And I'm so interested. I have to reread it because I'm very interested in all of the world building you've done, because it seems like at every corner there's like 3 new ideas that could be explored further. Do you feel that, let me just get this right, you feel that the characters developed and the world developed around them, or vice versa? Kind of.
I mean, I did create this character of Lula Nomi, who's this female private detective with a twist, obviously, as you discover, as she kind of continues to investigate this missing journalist that she's looking for. But I guess what I'm saying is, so I did start with a character, but for me, such a big part of this book in particular was the world. I mean, this for me is my love letter to, Blade Runner, is my love letter to the British weekly science fiction comic 2000 AD that I know you're taking an interest in as well, is my love letter to that 80s anime Robotech, to things like Hodorowski and Mobius's Inco.
Did you say Robotech? Like the are they like jets that transform? Or am I?
No, you're right.
Yeah.
It was one just sort of before Transformers. Like obviously, it was a sort of Japanese show. It was obviously drawn an awful lot better. But yeah, it was amazing and was a sort of super intense kind of epic. Really sort of character led. But this amazing world, and I guess as a kid, like maybe all of us who love science fiction had that to some extent, just really enjoyed inhabiting those worlds. I mean, I love the first Blade Runner film as a story. I mean, it's like almost a perfect story. But even if there wasn't a story, I could just watch the thing on silent or with music. I mean, I just love the buildings. I love the interiors. I love what everybody's wearing. And so when Ricardo and I got together to produce this book, we spent months and months and months, like to a sort of ridiculous degree, just talking about like what shoes she was wearing, or what her suit looked like, and the color of her suit, and what the technology looked like, and what a taxi would look like. And I mean, it was insane. We went down a complete rabbit hole. I hope shows.
I love because that's what I like. I like the story a lot, but like I'm so interested in the world building of all stories. Like I love the elements that go into the building the world itself. Like I'm more so The Mandalorian came out recently.
Then I totally felt that. And then look, you need a good story, I mean, I hope I delivered that and characters and you dress it. But for me, it was so primary to sort of give readers that world that they could go into and just spend time on the pages. And I mean, Ricardo and the level of detail that he did, which, it's got something to do with, I mean, there's not a lot of good stories about lockdown and the pandemic, but certainly this was a kind of happy ending, or sort of a positive, one of the positives that came out of it, which is, this was basically created and began to be produced in the lockdown. So we just had endless time to look at things and talk and draw and watch films and discuss. So it really gave us this amazing bedrock to work from.
I love that. So you guys worked like hand in hand to build all of this.
Sure. I mean, I had the script ready by the time, by the time I started talking seriously to Ricardo. But as you'll see, I mean, again, like the script, I had a very definite vision of what this world was going to look like. And then it tripled with Ricardo on board. I mean, just what he's brought to it and the level of imagination and detail, just took it to the next level. But it was really interesting because it's almost like dating or learning a language or something. It's like, at first, when we were talking, he'd say things and I'd be like, I don't really see that. And I would say something and he was like, I'm not mad about that. And then as you go on, you kind of hit this rhythm. And then, I mean, by the end of it, there is, I can honestly say there's nothing in that book that I'm not absolutely delighted with, and a lot of it was his innovation. So he just elevated it massively.
So, okay, let's get into that. Cause I'm obsessed with the world. Like I love seeing there's this towards the beginning when we learn pretty much the Western world has ended.
Yeah. Opening scene, the end of the West.
Yeah. The end of the West.
Like next week. It's like the news next week, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Felt very science fiction when I wrote it, but yeah.
What year is it? Oh, we got 100 more years. So everyone ends up and Johannesburg, South Africa becomes like the city, the mother city of Earth, pretty much.
Yeah.
What made you want to build your world starting there?
Well, I grew up in Pretoria, which was the capital city of South Africa, during apartheid. So it was like a police state. We didn't get television. We didn't get newspapers, magazines. No bands were allowed to tour. So we were in a complete bubble. And the only thing that made it through under the radar were comic books. So I was obsessed with comic books. So that's a kind of primary thing. And then obviously a little bit later, like when I was still a kid, Mandela was released and he became the president and apartheid ended and we were sort of welcomed into the world. But we were still, we weren't producing our own films. I mean, South Africa still doesn't really produce a lot of cinema, or the fiction is actually really kind of is really getting going there. And there's a good comic scene as well. But everything that we were reading and watching was being imported from the US mostly, or Japan, or the UK. And I felt really strongly that I'd grown up in Africa, and there is so much that Africa has to offer, and there's such strong culture, and it's just up to recently, it's been completely invisible. Now, I'm really happy to say that's changing massively now, and there's a huge curiosity, I think, in terms of literature and art and fashion, and that's all shifting. So I felt like I wanted to set my book there, and it was a little bit of a wry, kind of bitchy, humorous beginning, where it's like I start off with like Europe and America's gone, and now we're in Africa, so that's where the story starts. Like without really explaining terribly much. So that was the sort of inspiration for it, just to kind of give that science fiction like back to Africa, or for kids growing up there to read a book, that I think is very broad. I think somebody in the US can, really, really get it very easily, in the UK and Europe. But I think it's quite cool for African kids to have their own, their own book, to sort of think this is happening where we live.
I have to say, I love having these conversations because talking with someone about their art helps paint other art in new lights. Because like, I love Neil Blomkamp, love the way that he builds worlds.
Amazing.
But District 9 makes sense now. Like, I was like, I never really understood the theme.
Listen, can I tell you something about District 9? It's hilarious. The whole cast was in my drama class because I went to the first film school that opened in Johannesburg. So the round tower, which was like around where the aliens lived, that was basically where the cocaine barons lived, and they dealt cocaine. And so Blomkamp is basically doing this kind of joke on sort of weird aliens are basically the coke dealers, and all of my friends were the actors like in that film. So me watching that film was just like, oh my God, this is like literally my university life on screen with,
that's wild.
aliens. So yeah, man, it totally connects to that. Blomkamp was completely coming from the same place. I don't think he'd grown up I think he'd left when he was quite a lot younger, but he totally nailed it, and he came back and he did it. It's an amazing achievement. It totally linked to that. You're right. It's
so interesting. Like I'm fully ignorant in a lot of things, and I'm very open to admit that. So getting to have these conversations and be like, holy shit, like I don't get to see the art that comes out of things like apartheid and things like that. Now that I'm having these conversations and seeing this stuff, it's like, oh shit, this has always been there. I just haven't had the eyes to see it yet.
But honestly, Dan, that's not necessarily true. I mean, there are things, but it actually hasn't always been there because there wasn't an audience to watch it. I mean, most people didn't have electricity in South Africa, let alone cinemas or televisions. So, I think TV came to South Africa in the late 70s or something. So it actually wasn't being produced. I mean, cinema is something that is produced for a very advanced, rich technological society. And that's just not what South Africa is or was really. But it is interesting to see these stories start to bubble up and to kind of unpack them. And as you say, like to maybe be able to rewatch District 9 and basically see that it's kind of quite comedic look at like snapshot of kind of, late 90s, early noughties, Johannesburg cocaine trade done as science fiction. It's so brilliantly done.
Wild. That's damn. Okay, so back to your. I'm like all of it's like taking my brain. Now with this, how would you describe the theme? Because I wanted to say it was cyberpunky, but I think it's way more than just that. Because there's aliens. There's these robots that. There's one in the beginning who's basically telling the main character they need their rent. And I'm like, do they have sentience? Like it is, as I said earlier, like every time I see another panel, it's like, oh, I could follow this through line to a whole nother story.
I'm so pleased you feel that because I would love to do that. And I'd love to continue to kind of build this world. So that's the ambition. So I'm really pleased you felt like that. I guess, dude, I don't want to be too prescriptive about it because, it's like, I mean, my main ambition was to create something which was as enjoyable as Blade Runner or Akira or one of these great pieces of work that people could just dive into and enjoy themselves. But again, like I can't help but sort of think that if I really unpack what this is about, you start to see these kind of social hierarchies in the book of kind of, humans are at the top in inverted commas, and then robots are kind of second because they look like humans. And then aliens are kind of third, especially if they look like humans. And the uglier and the weirder the aliens are, the less acceptable they are. And so it sort of mirrors racism in South Africa, in America, in the world, basically, about how we perceive ourselves and hierarchies of society. So I didn't really mean to do that, but I really saw it as a theme when I'd finished. It was like, oh, actually, yeah, this is really present.
It just happened.
Yeah. Like the best things when you write, when you're not trying to do it, but when you look back, you're like, oh, obviously these things are things that are important to me and that I've seen. So of course that comes through.
God, So I think you and I need to have a conversation after this book comes out so we can deep dive into it, because there is a lot about the third class of the aliens and how they're treated.
Yeah.
Again, it's not one of the main themes of the, like, it's one of the main themes, but it's not like a story we follow because we're dealing with a lot of other things. But like following, I'm not going to spoil it because there's like a newspaper element. It is very reflective of the world, and I'm like,
and it's got to do, obviously, I mean, there's such upheaval happening at the moment. It has got to do with kind of social media and the big tech companies, and this concept I keep coming back to of sort of these kind of utopianist ideologues who run these tech companies, who genuinely actually do believe they're creating some kind of paradise or utopia, but it's so dangerous because, you know, their utopia is, you know, somebody else's hell.
Yeah.
So, you know, so it's kind of, it's also looking at that, like how are we allowing ourselves to be controlled by big companies, and what are they saying to us, and what are they actually doing? So I guess that's also quite a current thing. I mean, if you really break it right down though, you know, it is this really old fashioned or old school, maybe not, hopefully not old fashioned, but old school American gumshoe kind of genre. And I just love an American gumshoe. You know, I love all that Dashiell Hammett, and, you know, I mean, all of those old classics are just absolutely wonderful. You know, because you've got this kind of isolated individual who is investigating their environment, and they become a really useful tool as the reader or as the writer to be able to explore a world and kind of just deep dive into it while they follow one thread. So, yeah, I mean, that's probably the primary story, I guess.
I really liked this book.
I'm so pleased.
There's so much. There's so many things that I want to talk about, but I don't want to spoil it for anyone else. So I know you said comic books are a huge influence on you in your youth, but as an adult, what about science fiction appeals to you more than other genres? Like, what do you think is special about it?
So I would say the two genres that I probably like most are horror and science fiction, for different reasons. And because we're talking about science fiction here, I just think there's something really cool about science fiction, that you take an idea and you almost follow it to its logical conclusion and really max it out and just take it to the sort of absolute extreme. And it's almost always about contemporary issues. You know what I mean? Like, even if it is an idea of what would it be like in, like, you know, old 1950s American science fiction where everything was kind of so wonderful and everyone's eating like spinach tablets on the moon in this fabulous electric car. You know, it's like, that's really telling of the optimism of what was happening in America. Now, I mean, geez, you wouldn't find an optimistic science fiction anywhere.
No.
You know, so it's like, so I find it's a really interesting kind of spiritual and subconscious snapshot of a culture, you know. And then, of course, you've got these amazing masters. Like, I think probably the first proper prose books that I read as a child, and probably even as a young man, like I was quite a late reader. I mean, I always read comics, but reading kind of novels and stuff, probably at, I think, about 10 or 11, I started reading Frank Herbert and read that whole Dune series probably 5 or 6 times. I just absolutely adored it. And
you went from not reading to reading Dune 5 or 6 times.
Yeah, that was it. It was like, you know, that was the Bible. That was the Bible. It was just like,
Dune's not a tiny book either.
No. Just, you know, decided to sort of to set the bar high, and I still love it so much, you know. And I think that really sort of showed. It's such a nice canvas to explore ideas, you know. And then another person who really impacted me later, but I mean, obviously his hand is in so much science fiction that's not just his, is Philip K. Dick, you know, just the way he's got such a sort of unique way of approaching science. It's so personal and it's so odd, some of it, you know. He doesn't, I don't know, there's something so strange and uncanny about the way he approaches it. That was a real inspiration for me. And it was a real inspiration for this book as well, actually. You know, for Wiper, I really liked the way Philip K. Dick did things like Ubik, that sort of strange book where you're not 100% sure, of the environment. It keeps changing. There are these sort of glitches in reality. Yeah. So he was a big, and it just feels like science fiction is, of all the genres, one of the things where you just have the biggest canvas, just to go absolutely crazy on your ideas, and I think that was one of my challenges for this. Like, I think, I just love the idea of kind of all these alien races, and I didn't even want to get bogged down with properly unpacking them. Like, it was more, I just wanted to pack as much strangeness as I could possibly pack into the book. And Ricardo is so funny in this book. I mean, I still open the book sometimes and look at some of the panels and will find some bizarre creature that I'm like, I want to just write a book about this character. I mean, I just never seen anything quite like it. I loved that. I wanted it to be this kind of generous, almost like a Hieronymus Bosch's painting, Garden of Unearthly Delights, just like too much, but just delicious, like a big feast.
People can't see this right now, but I'm looking away because I am currently looking at the book on my iPad to pull up. There is a sequence later in the book near Tentacle Town with a bar. I can't remember the bar's name, but
Pink Diamond Ordeal Bar.
I would read 3 books about that alone, because there's a very funny sequence that happens in the bar and everyone's just like, yep, that's Tuesday. And like, I was like, this is awesome. Like, I love this vibe that all of these people have. I guess, dude, I'm so pleased you enjoyed them. And I guess that's this like love that I have, like living in this incredibly boring town, like many of us have spent time in at some point, with a sort of added military lockdown. It was just so boring. Like, you couldn't go out. There was nothing happening. There was no music. There was no life. So I always had this like real fantasy of like, what was Harlem like in the 20s and 30s? What was Shanghai like? What was, what were these places like, And so that was really interesting to me. And I really wanted to kind of pour that into the book as well. Tentacle Town is a sort of homage to all those weird places where all these cultures smash up against each other and create all this newness. That makes like, it's like a what was it, the Harlem Renaissance, things like that, where there was like all of this art and music and life, and people were just there doing it constantly, like with each other, learning. And wow, that makes so much sense, because I was wondering where, like, I don't want to call it psychedelic, but like there's this elevated level to things like Tentacle Town and some of the sequences. Yes. So what really inspired that? Like, the inspiration was thinking about these places where art was kind of reborn.
It was. And like, it's all about mutation and hybridization. And I think in a time when America is hysterical about what they call immigrants, although obviously everyone in America is an immigrant.
Yeah.
And the same as in the UK, where we're all immigrants as well. Like, I mean, what we consider British people are mostly, are now mostly Normans, who are French, basically coming in, although now suddenly England hates France. Like, it's just so bizarre, this kind of terror of the other and trying to isolate ourselves. And I think places like the Harlem Renaissance and Shanghai and those beautiful places were just the opposite of that. It was all about mutation. It's like, Burroughs being in Tangier, all these kind of these places where you could get newness, basically, and fresh ideas. And I think, having said earlier in this interview, I think that one of the greatest challenges was look at Blade Runner, the first film, and then look at the second film, which is Blade Runner. Is it 2058? Anyway, the second one.
Whatever one was the second one.
You look at the difference between those two films. It's not like the first Blade Runner world is amazing, like in terms of, there's unhappiness, there's problems, there's all this kind of stuff, but every scene you want to be in those, you want to go, you want to.
It doesn't feel like it's coming to an end.
Yeah,
it feels like you're coming into a living world.
That's it. And I think the second film, even the palette, everything's beige, everything's gray, everything's depressing. So for me, what I was trying to do, and I think you'll see it in a lot of cinema and comics, it's harder and harder to do optimistic science fiction. And I was absolutely determined to do an optimistic piece of science fiction. So I was having to go back to what are the bedrock concepts for newness and freshness, and to fight what's happening to us all culturally at the moment, internationally. And for me, I was coming back to those places. And it is, as you say, elevated and crazy and overly colorful. And then, you know, I mean, the other thing that I have to mention is obviously Brad Simpson, who's the colorist, because he is like, you know, the kind of invisible, you know, in inverted commas, partner in terms of this book, because we spent an awful lot of time, me and Ricardo, briefing him on the color and getting him to the place that we'd spent, you know, 9 months or a year getting to together, you know, and then Brad had to come in and color this thing. And it was not easy. I mean, you can see how complex these images are. And we had such a specific language in play at that point. So he was absolutely remarkable. And I almost feel like the colors are like a character in the book almost.
Yeah, because one of my questions was about the coloring, because these sequences are so like intricate with those kinds of feelings. So did Brad come on afterwards? Like, how did you describe how these things should look?
I mean, he came in a long way down the track. So we had a lot of the pages in play. I mean, I can't remember exactly, but I think we probably had a third or even half of the book done when he came on board. And then he just had to go through this sort of slightly frightful process, which, you know, you could sound, you know, really as if it's sort of slightly unnecessary. And I don't think you could do it on every project, but just as me and Ricardo had spent so long getting the look and feel and the design right, it just felt like we really had to get the colors right. So, I mean, we must have sent him hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images of sort of color swatches and ideas and cinema and, you know, and stuff. And he was so incredibly patient with us, because it really was a pain in the nuts. Excuse my language, but
no, you can say whatever you want.
He would basically, you know, he would color a page and he'd come back and we'd be like, oh no, maybe it's a bit more. No, actually, it was more like, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And a little bit of that, but once we broke that barrier, again, it was the same as with Ricardo. He just flew off and just did us so proud. I mean, again, some of those pages, I mean, I'm thinking about that. I don't really know how else to describe it, but the sort of alien sex tent scene.
In my notes.
Yeah. that the color in that is just absolutely beautiful. And it's not such an easy thing to color. So I think when he'd done that, it was like, okay, your training wheels are off. Like you don't need any input anymore. You're going. And he did, you know, and it was interesting to see what he did, you know. And I think this is a journey, and it's almost like a journey like Dante's Inferno or something. You know, it's kind of, you're going through rings like of intensity. So, you know, you start on Earth and then you go up onto the Hive and then you go to Acadia and then you go to Tentacle Touch, just getting more and more intense. And he really picked up on that. And I think the coloring becomes more and more intense and denser. So that's it's almost like a sort of narrative element as well.
The I had one of my questions was surrounding that, but I've honestly just stopped asking questions and I'm now just conversating because I am enthralled with this book. But there is the alien sex scene. The first page is incredible. There's like, I'm not going to describe it fully because I want everyone to read it, but it's like very intimate and things like that. But the second page, there's no words. It is just one of the most beautiful pages I've seen, because it's like the most intimate connection you can. I'm staring at it right now. It's like the most intimate connection you can see maybe in a book, like in a comic that I've read in a very long time. It is unreal how well this team worked together. And I'm so hearing that poor Brad like had to come back and like really break his back for this, but it works so well because it feels like everything is firing on all cylinders. Because again, like when we see like these deep sequences of when you see like the Pink Diamond Ordeal, like that, the way it's colored isn't bland at all. There is so much going on because there's all this machinery and there's so many levels to this place, but everything is colored so well that everything stands out. While it could have been something that was a drab blue, brown, beige, and it just everything worked really well. And like the colors on some of these characters are just, oh God. Some of the alien characters are so beautiful, and like the colors are deep and like rich. There's like a tentacle one at one point.
Yeah. I mean, that was why it was honestly really nerve-wracking to wait to get the print copy back, because and I'm thinking about one scene in particular, which you'll know, which is where Lula is about to kind of graduate as a wiper, and she has her kind of final test, and it's in these really deep blues. And I loved what it's exactly what I wanted, but it was like, that could really not show up on the page, like really not show up on the page. But it does.
Oh yeah, I'm looking at it right now. Yes, I would be very worried as well.
Yeah. He took real chances, and we did that in a few places, and I feel like those risks we took really kind of worked out for us. So I was really pleased with that. And I mean, and then the other thing is, like, you know, the fun part of being a writer, working with such amazing people, like all of them, you know, Jim Campbell, the letterer, who's obviously like a big name in his own right. You know, they just make you look so good as a writer, because there's one page that I think about, which was actually so boringly written, where Lula basically is getting out of a taxi and she's just getting on a lift going down. I remember writing and just being like, God, this is such an important moment, but I have to just do this bridge, and I just can't make it very much more interesting than this. So I wrote it. It's one of my favorite scenes, because what Ricardo did with what the taxi looks like, what the lift looks like, this kind of descent into almost looks like a sort of subconscious or something. And then Brad's colors, it's like one of my favorite pages in the book. And I think that's what's just so exciting as a writer. It's one of the nicest things about being a comic writer anyway. It's like getting Christmas presents every day.
Yeah, every day.
When it works, it's just too much fun.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of beautiful perspective in this book. They're like some of the angles that they do they draw from is like you're looking up at these spectacles, and it feels like you're looking up, and it's not just like for listeners, I am pointing with my hands from my face. It is not directly in front of you. It is you looking up at some of these like monolithic sized things, but not even just that. There are like characters who, like, you know, are more powerful than what we've seen so far. And like the way they're drawn and the perspective you're given of them is just like, this is important.
I mean, that's a real intelligence in an artist. And I think Ricardo has that intelligence. You know, I mean, it's one thing to be able to create such an absolutely magnificent world and have such a wonderful design eye. And, you know, he loves architecture. So, you know, he's published, you know, a couple of comics in his time, but he's also published a couple of artist sketchbooks. So he did one about Israel. He did one about, I can't remember the other places he's been. He's done one about Lisbon, which is where he's based. And
he's in Lisbon?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Wait,
there's a good scene there.
I'll ask it. Yeah. I worked for a company whose entire tech scene was there. So like I've gotten to know those people very well.
Yeah. No. So he's very interested in architecture and design and, you know, the whole kind of thing. But as you say, there's a real difference between being able to draw and being able to create a comic book page and to draw
tell a story.
To tell a story. You're absolutely right. To tell a story and to link these things together, and then how the pages relate to each other and the turns. I mean, these are really basic things, but it's not everybody gets that. It's a muscle that either you have or you don't. You know, so really exciting to see him do that. I mean, we'd met actually at Thought Bubble years ago, pre-pandemic, and our friend Paul Gravett had introduced us. And Paul Gravett is a comic critic and writer, and he introduced a couple of other people that you probably would never have heard of, like Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean.
Yeah, just a couple little ones
like that, and you know, and is incredibly important in the European and British comic scene as a kind of critic and champion of artists and writers, and has been really, really important in putting people together. So he actually introduced us to each other, and we'd done a couple of pitches. You know, we'd done a pitch for a book called Big Blue Bitch, which was basically like a sort of.
I love that title.
It's my She-Hulk. I just love She-Hulk so much. I love those female characters. I love Artemis and I love Spider-Woman and all of those guys. They're amazing. But anyway, so we put this thing together, and then we done a few other bits and pieces. So we hadn't really done more than, I think we'd done like 5 or 6 page pictures together before this thing, came together. And and I think you were saying you were interested in it as a graphic novel as opposed to a compilation of floppies. And I guess that's another result of the lockdown and the pandemic and all the disruptions that started to happen. I'd had a series which was Go at Dark Horse, and then it wasn't Go at Dark Horse, and and basically Dark Horse have always been amazing to me, and I've got a great relationship with them. But of course, we know it was across Marvel, it was across DC, it was across Image. I mean, there were paper shortages, there were distribution collapses. It was just a really difficult time, and so we were very pleased when we managed to get this project away at Dark Horse together, and I think they felt it was easier for them to just do it as a graphic novel. And it really changed the mentality in a funny way of what we were doing. And then, of course, we had all this time on our hands. So I think it makes it into quite a special beast. It feels different from a compilation somehow.
So I'm a big fan of releasing things as graphic novels versus floppies. And I call them floppies. I have written on, this is like maybe the only subject I have written like where I've researched and done like a lot of work to like put out something very, very real. Mostly I write from my heart, but this one was like, this is statistics. Here's your reason. That graphic novels are a better business model than floppies. But personally, I believe it's a better way to read a story. I know there is so like even Dickens was in like magazine, like newspaper. You have to read it in like chunks, but getting to read the story in one go felt like I'd love more, but like getting to read it in one solid book let me really unpack the themes in a way it probably would have taken me until the trade to really get it, if that makes sense. You're
right. There's a coherency that is afforded by you having that as a single book. Even the psychology of just having it in your hands or your digital file, it's one piece. It's of a piece. And I think you're right. I think that does have an impact on the story and how you absorb the story for sure.
It what I'm doing. Like people will know listening to this. Like I actually like this book because I have to stop myself so many times because like all I want to do is talk about it. I'm trying to think. I'm glad you got to the graphic novel thing because I really wanted to know why that versus floppies.
Yeah, and we were very happy with that. It definitely felt like the right thing, and it allowed us as well to. I mean, I guess the biggest luxury of that is that you can edit properly. You can at the end take something out or kind of remove things that you just can't tweak if you're floppy.
And
so there's a bit of a cheat in that as well. Kind of makes it extra special editing.
Getting to listen to like how this all came about. It sounds like this is way better than doing one at a time because you got the chance to be like, okay, like this doesn't work. Like let's push like with bringing on colors and stuff like that. Because sometimes like I know in major big 2 things, some people don't even really get to talk to their colorists. Like it just goes to them, which sucks because like you're trying to build a story on your world and you got the chance to do it all together.
But Dan, it's funny though because I don't know whether you've read Grant Morrison's book Super Gods, which I think is
I'm not a prose guy, but it is that's one of the ones I've read. Like I really love that book.
It's just absolutely fantastic. I just love that book. I love Grant Morrison anyway, but
yeah,
I love that book. And I just love his absolute unabashed love of kind of Silver Age madness. Like I think he talks about that one where sort of Lois Lane is a fish. She's sort of on a fish head, and just absolutely bonkers stuff. That he really I think channeled in his Doom Patrol run. But their
work is so. It's funny. I actually met them. at New York one year. I didn't realize they were right next to us. And I accidentally told Grant Morrison that I didn't like Batman, rest in peace. No, incredible, because we got to have a real, like, a nice conversation. I was honestly dumb. I'm just dumb. Got a smooth brain, just rolls right off. But then I reread it as an adult and was like, oh, this rocks. But Animal Man is like one of those books that'll stick with me forever.
Also, the other thing is he's done such a wide range of material that basically you can't but find something that you love. And I think that's a real strength as a writer, that there's this huge body of work. You don't have to like all of it. But basically my point was going to be just slightly that as much as I do like this idea of doing a single book, and it does allow you to hone things more and kind of edit better, I will always have a big place in my heart for just like the sheer sleaze and trash stratum fantasticness of that quick fire comics that had to happen at a certain period and that still happen, that you kind of, I mean, one of the things that I was going to mention to you, I was looking through my comics and stuff to think about things to talk to you about as inspirations. And one was the Paul Levitz and Keith Giffen Legion of Superheroes. It's so crackers. Have you read it?
So Legion is the one. So this actually started as a DC podcast way back in the day. I have not read anything Legion of Superheroes. Like, it is my one spot of the DC universe. Nothing. Well,
it's a really particular thing. And I personally, it's not my major shtick. So I wouldn't be proposing you read huge amounts of it. But that Paul Levitt and Keith Giffen.
I've only heard good things. My brother swears by it.
It's wonderful. And I think it's a little bit like I think you'll like it because it's a little bit like what you were talking about, Wipeout. I mean, every page is so stuffed full of so many ideas. Sometimes you just like, you sit on a page and you're like, what is this building? Like, what is this? What is coming out of this ship? Like, what? And then you turn over and it's just like straight back into the story. But you're like, it is so dense with imagination. And what I quite like about that is it's just all throwaway because they're doing it quickly. So it's almost like from their subconscious or something, or from a cultural subconscious. And I think that's the cool thing about quickfire, is that sometimes you don't even have time to edit yourself, and that can be quite interesting. But personally, I like having the time. But
I am a fan, and I have been drugged through the mud by certain founders of large companies for saying floppies rather than single issues. So I will.
I didn't realize there was a
controversy by old white men who probably, I don't want to get, he's an asshole, but so I only call them floppies now on principle.
Excellent. It's like I'm always very amused when, obviously you and I are comic geeks, so we understand that there actually is almost like a technical difference between a graphic novel and a comic.
Yeah.
But really, like, I have absolutely no problem if somebody calls what I do a comic, because it is a comic.
Because it is a comic.
It's always very funny when like people who don't know comics are like, oh yeah, John does comics. Oh, I mean graphic novels. Do you do graphic novels? Don't you? It's like, well, I don't really mind to do that. I interviewed Dan Clowes years ago for Ghost World, for the movie. And Ghost World is one of my favorite graphic novels of all time. I think it's absolutely, masterpiece. And he was just talking a lot about that. Is that, one of the downsides about, Chris Ware and him and others being accepted into this kind of literary canon is that suddenly, like, you lose the kind of sleazy underbelly of like, you can just do whatever you want. Now suddenly there's like an expectation and some sort of pressure almost to produce a specific kind of thing. And I think comics still allow that freedom in a way that other mediums don't really have. You know?
I think comics, like, because I think you can do more story-wise when you have a visual. For me, at least, like, as a reader, when I can see something, I'm like, oh, all right. Like, you can do whatever you want with prose, but like, I don't know. I think there's a different freedom to comics than there are to prose or other things. I've interviewed actors and things recently who are writing comics, and it's like they approach it from a movie mindset. Like, how would I want to see this visually? And I'm like, that's cool, but like, do you feel that limits the imagination? Because you're like, what can I do in the physical realm? But Um,
I'm going to get so technical on your ass here. So, cut it out if it's boring for your poor listeners. But the thing that I really am turned on by, and I keep coming back to, are the Japanese creators like Junji Ito, like Kazuo Umezu.
Not boring at all. Like, this is what I want to hear.
Like Hideshi Hino. And they were actually, I can't explain it. Like, they are absolutely comics. Like, I mean, their mastery of the comics medium, I think, is almost beyond any other group of creators from any other country. I mean, they're incredible. But there is something a little bit more cinematic. And when I say cinematic, maybe it's not cinematic. It's just what I really like about them, and that I try to do in Wiper. And you might have noticed that the last couple of panels don't have any captions or words on them. And there's a few places in the book where that happens. And that's my little nod to those guys, because I really love that decompression that they allow themselves, and that they just allow themselves to draw breath sometimes and just look at something, because I think growing up as a kid in sort of late 70s, I was only born then, but it's like I was reading in my childhood, like late 70s, 80s and 90s comics, because they were still around. And I think particularly with Marvel, they were just so dense in that period. Like, every panel had about 8,000 characters, all shouting at the same time. And it was just too much. I thought DC was much more kind of quiet, and sort of allowed a little bit more breathing space. But then the Japanese are another level again. And actually now, as I'm older, I actually like all of those things. I quite like the dense craziness, and I like the middle ground, but there's something about that slowness that I always try and sandwich into my book somewhere, because I really love those Japanese creators. And there's such good stuff being published at the moment. Like Viz is just doing this amazing set called Orochi by Kazuo Umezu. They're now spelling it Kazuo Umezu.
What was it called? Orochi?
Yes, Orochi, Orochi. And it's like I think that means blood or something. I don't know, but it's just.
So this started as my brother and I. My brother has been a huge manga person pretty much his whole life, and I have been very much not until maybe a year ago. And I started reading Junji, because I'm a huge horror person, Junji Ito, like, I was like, oh fuck, like I don't know what horror can do. Like, holy shit.
No. Spiral is there's nothing, there's no other words. It's an absolute masterpiece. Like, it's perfect. And there's, so that's exactly what I'm saying. There's opening pages that they do in Spiral where you have one or two pages colored, and it's like a girl like wandering dreamily through a field, and then like looks at the lighthouse, and then the book starts. It's just I just love, and then it goes along at a clip. I just love those moods, those moments. It's just wonderful.
It's incredible. And something about manga just like has drawn me in so much more recently than comics have. Like, I'm so into, I read Chainsaw Man in a day, literally from the first issue until volume like 13 in a single sitting. I was like, this is like,
I haven't read it yet, but I've heard it's amazing. So I'm going to go off and get it.
Violent. It is horrific, and it is extremely horny. It is
tick.
It's incredible. I cannot recommend that book enough. But
bold.
Yeah, I can see the unpacking that you do in this. There is a sequence where there is a singer, and I stayed on this page for a bit because it's very erotic. Like, it's very beautiful, and like she is there. Like, their outfit is so cool, but like there's 1, 2, 3, like 4 panels of just them singing, and it's unpacked it in a way that you get to see this culture of like this world you've never been to. Like, it is a world within itself, and you're like, this is like, there is art in this, like there's art going on in this world that you're reading. Yeah. And I that kind of stuff, like the unpacking and letting things kind of like breathe for a second, is awesome, because there are some sequences as well as you're seeing these monolithic things. Like there's a sewer sequence that starts, and it's like shadow, the investigator, and then like you could just see this whole like huge sewer with a giant like hole. It's like great stuff. Now
and that's the beauty of comics, you know, because I mean, just with that, it's like it's such a nice way of showing a journey in the pitch dark. Like, you know, it's so basic, but it's like it just allows the reader to kind of sit still for a moment, even if their eyes traveling. Anyway, I could rant all day about the medium. It's just such a cool medium.
It's so good. So my last big question, because we haven't talked about this is the investigative style of it. For you, what makes a good noir story?
I'm going to be quite controversial here and say,
all right.
And I also don't want to put readers off by saying this. I mean, I hope that you'll agree that there's a good twist in this thing and that there's a bit of a reveal and that satisfies that thing as an investigation. But for me, as I say, it goes back to what I said earlier. It's almost like Pilgrim's Progress or Dante descending into the Inferno. What I really like most about an investigator is this kind of, they're always a bit of a schmo. And our private investigator, Lula, is a bit of a schmo. She's broke. You know, she doesn't know who she is, quite literally. She's got no money. She doesn't know where she's going. She doesn't know what the hell she's doing or why she's doing it. And I don't know why. I just really like those characters, you know. And then I like the fact that in a lot of these kinds of stories with these PIs, you have this idea of I mean, as they solve a mystery, they're also learning about themselves, you know, always. So there's always a kind of personal revelation, and I guess I've really kind of maxed it up in this one in particular. But those are the elements that I like generally, and I love the genre. I mean, I read so much detective fiction, you know, from the 30s all the way through to now, really. I mean, a lot of good Japanese stuff too. You know, they're reprinting a lot of 1960s Japanese detective fiction on the UK, and I love it. So there's something about Gumshoes I just like.
I have to get more into I've read Monster, which has to do with I've only read the first volume because it's very hard to find volumes of this book, which I learned is kind of hard to do sometimes for manga. Like some books is really hard to find.
Well, I mean, one of the things is like Hideshi Hino, who I think is one of the great masters. I mean, I bought a set of those books, what were called Theatre of Horror or something. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, it was a set of all the Hideshi Hino. And I missed 2 or 3 of them. Now they're like, you know, £80 a copy or something because they've just not been reprinted. You know, but Ito obviously has, you know, been really, really received, you know, that his due, and basically is, you know, is very available, you know, as is Umezu, which I'm delighted by.
It's so funny. The Junji Ito, like a sidebar, like being the stuff that man creates, like his art is horrific. Have you ever watched like anything with him as a person, just like being talked? No. I'll try to find it and send it to you. He did something for Viz where he looked at American horror stuff. Do you know Trevor, who does like, he Slimy Swamp Beast or something? Yeah. His art is incredible. Watching Junji Ito talk about it, he's just like this kind man. Like he's just very quiet, and like I've only heard that he is the gentlest, kindest person.
Man, those are the ones you have to watch.
Yeah, but
I told you.
But other people, the other people who like make like the beautiful like, what is that one that everybody loves? The Totoro guy. Like he's like a hardcore kind of person.
Exactly. Yes.
And it's so funny to hear that like the man who creates the worst horror versus this guy, like they're,
you know, and the other guy's like a kind of samurai who chop your off if you.
What was I going to say? I had one more. Oh, if you haven't read it, Junji Ito did a book about cats, about his cats personally.
Oh, wow.
It is my favorite thing that he's done.
Cat person, so you're talking to the right person.
It is just about him coming to terms with cats. And it is his art style, like very much his style. It is not a horror. It is about him and these cats. And it is maybe one of my favorite comic things ever, because it's like a...
When did you get it? Like, is it available now?
Yeah, I got it. There's a special edition out now. One second. Let me get the name for you.
I'll do it.
so it's funny because like I wasn't a cat person until my girlfriend. Now we have 2 cats and they're like my best friends. Yes. Oh, it's called Jan and Mew. And it's just his diary of him coming to terms with having these cats and him falling in love with them and like the weird things cats do. There's also a video of Junji Ito reacts to your cats. I can talk about him all. I love the stuff, but that is outside of the horror stuff. It is the most optimistic. It's wonderful. I cannot recommend that enough.
I'm so pleased to take that recommendation away.
Yes.
I'm literally going to buy it the second.
Yes. Oh, it is so worth it. That and Chainsaw Man are the 2 that I always put out. So who do you think will like this book? So like if someone's like, is this book for me? Who would you recommend it to?
I mean, this sounds a little bit disingenuous, but I mean, basically everybody. I mean, I think it can go. I mean, I would give it to kids that I know, maybe 13, 14, like just for the sheer kind of eye candy of it and the kind of space opera of it and the crazy machinery and the architecture and that kind of thing, all the way up to, I'd give it to my granny to have a read because, I hope that, it does look at some of those kind of larger issues we were talking about, sort of cultural and social and, to do with technology, to do with race, to do with class. So I kind of hope there's something in there for everybody. And also, I mean, I've tried to do something which is a little bit unusual. So, I am a massive sci-fi head. But, I've also given it to people to read who are not massively into science fiction. And I think there's a way to engage with it, even if you're not kind of a mega sci-fi fan. Mm-hmm. I hope it's quite broad. I hope that's not cheating saying that.
No, that's a good answer because I loved how you described it as a optimistic science fiction because that's what I need more of that in life because like shit's dark.
We all do. I genuinely think it says something about our cultures and our culture's subconscious and our culture's spiritual well-being. If we cannot produce optimistic science fiction, there's something really wrong. Yeah. I think it's like, in a way, it's my job to do that. And I feel like, I hope I have done that with this. The next thing I'm going to do is going to be some sort of brutal horror. So that'll be the other side.
Good. I mean,
so, we'll talk about that next.
Yeah. But, horror.
Meanwhile, I leave you with my optimistic science fiction.
Yeah. I really wanted to talk about what a wiper is, but I want people to read it themselves because I want them to get to know this world a little bit because the wiper concept is so interesting to me because it deals so closely to identity. After this book comes out, you and I are going to have another conversation where we just talk about and just dig into all this because
because as you say, it's looking at identity, it's looking at memory, and it's and then you also see there's something to do with gender as well. And I think all of us nowadays are asked, which I'm really pleased about. For me, I think that's a really great progress in our society. That I think we're all asked and sort of invited to look really seriously at our genders and how we want to inhabit those or change them or for that to mutate into something else. So I think there's something of that in this book as well. That was something that I think is important.
Yeah. Well, are there any other things people should be picking up from you? Any other books currently that you have out?
Well, I mean, I would love people, if they enjoy this, to go back and read Tumult, which is the book that I did with artist Mike Kennedy. I mean, that's still available. And it's also it's a little bit more like a Patricia Highsmith, kind of quite classic noir mystery. There's no science fiction. It's all set in North London in sort of quite Gothic architecture. So if people like this, then then feel free to go back and read as well. And as I said, I'll be announcing a series quite soon as well, which will come out in sort of monthly installments as well. And as soon as I can talk about it, you won't be able to shut me up.
Beautiful. You can find us at gatecrashers.fan and on all social media at gatecrasherspod. But thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited for people to read the book.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. It's really just been wonderful talking to you. Thanks.
Let's do
it again soon.
Yes.
The Gatecrashers.